The market was loud. It was always loud. If you stood at the very back of the huge hall where the seafood stalls were lined up, the noise hit you like a heavy weight. There was the constant slapping sound of wet fish hitting metal tables. There was the sharp hiss of the hoses washing away the ice and the scales. People were shouting everywhere. Fresh cod. Best price in town. Get your shrimp before they're gone. It was a messy, wet, chaotic place where the floor was always slippery and the air smelled heavy of salt and the ocean. But for Henry, this wasn't just noise. This was his life. Henry stood behind his narrow metal counter, right in the middle of the action. He was a big man, not fat, just solid. He had broad shoulders and arms that were thick from lifting heavy crates of ice and boxes of seafood all day, every day. His skin was tanned a deep brown from the sun, even though he spent most of his time under the fluorescent lights of the market roof, and it was rough, almost like leather. Years of handling crabs and sharp fish bones had left their mark on his hands. His knuckles were scraped, his fingernails were cut short to the quick, and his skin was always dry from the salt water. He wore a long, thick plastic apron that was stained black and gray in places. It was covered in fish scales that shimmered like little diamonds when the lights hit them. On his feet, he wore heavy rubber boots that made a loud squeak sound every time he shifted his weight. Henry didn't say much. He didn't shout like the other sellers. He just watched the people walking by with sharp, dark eyes that were hidden under the brim of a worn-out baseball cap. He knew exactly who was looking for dinner and who was just passing through. He could see the regulars coming from a mile away, the old lady who liked her fish filleted very thin, the man who wanted the biggest crab regardless of the price, the young mother who was always in a rush. On this particular morning, the crowd was thicker than usual. It was a Tuesday, but maybe the weather had brought people out. The aisles between the stalls were packed with shopping carts and strollers. Henry moved with a rhythm that he had perfected over 30 years. A customer would point. Henry would reach down into the pile of crushed ice, grab a fish by the tail, and in one smooth motion, swing it up onto the cutting board. Whack. Then the sound of the knife scraping against the scales, a quick flick of the wrist to remove the head, and another slice to clean it. It took him 10 seconds. 15, if the customer was picky. 3 mackerel, please, a tired-looking man said, leaning over the counter. Henry didn't nod. He just turned, grabbed 3 shiny, silver fish, and put them on the board. He was fast, but he was careful. He respected the fish. He didn't just hack at them, he cut them precisely so there was no waste. Most people didn't look at Henry. They looked at the fish, they looked at the prices written on the whiteboard behind his head with the red marker. To them, he was just part of the machine. He was the guy who took the money and handed over the package. They saw the stained apron and the rubber boots and assumed he didn't know much about anything else. They saw the rough hands and the silence and thought he was simple. A young couple stopped in front of the stall. They were dressed in nice clothes, clean and pressed, very different from the jeans and sweaters of the regular shoppers. The woman was scrolling on her phone, barely looking up. The man wrinkled his nose slightly. It was a smell that took some getting used to, the smell of raw seafood and seawater, but to Henry, it just smelled like work. It smelled like earning a living. Are these fresh? The man asked, pointing at a pile of large, pink prawns. Henry stopped wiping down his knife. He looked the man in the eye. Came in off the boat at 4 this morning, Henry said. His voice was deep and gravelly, like stones crunching together. The man hesitated. He looked at the prawns, then back at Henry. He seemed skeptical. They look sleepy, he said. Henry didn't laugh. They've been on ice since 4. They're dead. They don't move much. He didn't mean to be rude, he was just telling the truth. He didn't have time for games. The woman finally looked up from her phone. Let's just get them, she said impatiently. She clicked her tongue, clearly wanting to leave the smelly aisle as quickly as possible. Henry reached into the ice with his bare hands. His fingers were red and chapped from the cold. He scooped up the prawns, weighed them, and dropped them into a plastic bag. He tied the knot with a quick twist of his wrist. $14, Henry said. The man handed over a crisp $20 bill. Henry took it, his rough fingers brushing against the man's smooth, manicured hand. He opened the metal cash register. It made a loud ding sound and counted out the change. He placed the coins and the receipt on the counter. Thanks, the man mumbled, grabbing the bag. He didn't say have a good day. He didn't look back. They walked away quickly, merging into the stream of people, disappearing as fast as they had arrived. Henry watched them go for a second, then turned back to his work. He picked up the hose and sprayed the counter, washing away the scales and the little bit of blood from the last fish. The water swirled around into the drain. It didn't bother him, the way people treated him. He knew what they saw. They saw a fishmonger. Someone who smelled. Someone who worked with his hands in a dirty place. They didn't see the person inside. They didn't know that he listened to opera on the radio when he drove his old truck to work at 3 a.m. They didn't know that he could look at a cloud and tell you exactly if it was going to rain or if it was just passing by. To the world, Henry was defined by his stall. He was the rough background noise to their shopping trip. He was the guy standing behind the ice. An older woman, a regular named Mrs. Gable, shuffled to the front of the line. She leaned on her cane and smiled at Henry. Her smile reached her eyes. "Good morning, Henry," she said softly. "The usual, please." Henry's face changed. It didn't soften completely. He had spent too many years keeping a straight face in a cold, wet environment, but the tension around his jaw relaxed. He didn't just nod this time. He actually gave her a small, almost invisible tilt of his head. "Morning, Mrs. Gable," he said. "Saved you a nice one." He reached under the counter, away from the ice that made the fish too cold for an old person to hold, and pulled out a perfect piece of haddock. It was firm and white. He wrapped it in white paper, folding the edges over neatly, the way she liked it. He put it in her hands. "Take care," he said. "You too, Henry," she said, and she meant it. As she walked away, Henry felt a little warmth in his chest, but he quickly pushed it down. There were more people waiting. A line was forming. The market was getting louder. The lunch rush was starting. He adjusted the brim of his cap. He pulled his sleeves up, revealing forearms that were strong and mapped with blue veins. He was ready for the next hour. He was ready to be invisible again. He was ready to be just the man behind the fish, because in this place, that was all he was allowed to be. Or so everyone thought. They had no idea what was hidden in his head, or what his rough, scarred fingers could really do when they weren't holding a knife. They just wanted their fish, and Henry was there to give it to them. The mid-morning rush was beginning to taper off, but the noise in the market remained constant. It was a different kind of noise now, less about the frantic shouting of the early bird sales and more about the steady hum of people doing their daily shopping. Henry stood still for a moment, wiping his hands on a towel tucked into his apron string. His back ached, a dull throb that he had learned to ignore years ago. It was just part of the job, like the cold water and the smell of raw shrimp. The crowd was changing, too. The morning regulars, the ones who knew exactly what they wanted and moved quickly, were gone. In their place came the browsers. The people who weren't in a hurry, the ones who treated the market like a museum exhibit rather than a place of business. Henry didn't mind them usually, as long as they didn't block the way for the actual customers. He watched them from behind his glasses. He saw tourists taking photos of the hanging crabs. He saw young couples arguing over what to cook for dinner. And then, he saw a group of 3 people walking toward his stall. They stood out immediately. It wasn't just their clothes, though those were certainly nicer than the usual sweatpants and raincoats. The man in the front wore a long, gray wool coat that looked expensive, with shiny black leather shoes that were entirely impractical for the wet, fishy floor. He was walking carefully, lifting his feet high to avoid the puddles, with a look of mild disgust on his face. Behind him were 2 women. They were dressed in bright colors, holding handbags that probably cost more than Henry made in a month. They were chatting loudly, their voices cutting through the ambient noise of the market. "Did you see the way that woman looked at me?" one of the women was saying, laughing a high-pitched, tinkling laugh. "She honestly thought I was going to buy those used books. As if I would touch something second-hand." They stopped right in front of Henry's stall. The man in the gray coat looked at the display of ice and fish, then he looked at Henry. His eyes swept over Henry, taking in the stained apron, the rubber boots, and the heavy knife in Henry's hand. He didn't see a person. He saw a prop. He saw a peasant in a storybook. Henry waited. He didn't smile. He didn't greet them. He just stood there, his hands resting on the edge of the metal counter. He knew their type. They were the kind of people who complained about the price of a lemon. They were the kind of people who would touch the fish and then wipe their hands on his counter, pretending they didn't know where to put the germs. "Look at these," the man said, pointing a gloved finger at a pile of large, whole sea bass. They were beautiful fish, shiny and silver, with clear eyes. "Are these wild?" Henry nodded. "Caught yesterday." "Line caught." The man turned to one of the women. "Shall we get a fish for tonight, darling? It might be fun to cook." "Like a real, rustic experience." The woman wrinkled her nose. She leaned closer to the ice but made sure not to let her coat touch the counter. "Oh, I don't know. It smells so strong down here. It's just so primitive, Isn't it? She looked at Henry as if he were a piece of furniture. Do you have anything that doesn't smell so much like the ocean? Henry looked at her. He kept his face blank, but inside, he felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Ma'am, he said, his voice low and steady. It is a fish market. The fish live in the ocean. That is why they smell like the ocean. The woman laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. It was a mocking laugh. She looked at her friends. Did you hear that? He thinks he's funny. She turned back to Henry. No, I mean, can't you wash it? It's just so unpleasant. Henry didn't answer. He knew better than to argue. If he washed the fish, it would ruin the flavor. It would ruin the texture. But trying to explain that to her would be like trying to explain algebra to a toddler. He picked up his towel and wiped the counter, waiting for them to decide or leave. The man in the gray coat seemed annoyed by the woman's hesitation. He wanted to show off. He wanted to be the provider. I'll take the sea base, he announced, pointing at the one Henry had been looking at earlier. And make sure it's cleaned properly. I don't want any surprises. Henry reached into the ice. He grabbed the fish by the tail. He felt the slick, cold skin against his palm. It was a good fish. A strong fish. He placed it on the board. Whack. The sound of the knife hitting the board was sharp. Henry worked quickly. He scraped off the scales. They flew everywhere, glistening in the light. The woman stepped back, putting her hand over her mouth as if she were watching a car crash. Disgusting, she whispered, but she said it loudly enough for Henry to hear. Be careful, the man said to Henry, waving his hand dismissively. Try not to make a mess. Henry didn't look up. He focused on the fish. He sliced the belly open, removed the insides, and scraped the cavity clean. He did it perfectly. He had done this millions of times. But the man wasn't watching the technique. He was watching Henry with a look of pity and superiority. It must be so hard, the man said suddenly. Henry paused, his knife hovering over the fish. He looked up. The man was looking at him with a smirk. Standing here all day, the man continued. In the wet and the cold. Smelling like, well, smelling like that. He gestured vaguely at the stall. I suppose it's the only work someone like you can do. Not much education required for slinging fish, is there? Just a strong back and a weak mind, eh? The two women laughed. They didn't laugh because it was a good joke. They laughed because he was the man in the expensive coat, and that was what they were supposed to do. Henry felt a hot spark of anger flare up in his stomach, but he pushed it down just as fast. He looked at the man. He saw the softness of his hands. He saw the way he stood, with his chest puffed out, trying to make himself look bigger. Henry thought about many things in that split second. He thought about the books he had read. He thought about the music he heard in his head. He thought about the complexity of the ocean currents and the biology of the fish he held in his hand. This man knew nothing about any of that. He only knew the price of a coat. Henry finished cleaning the fish. He wrapped it in the paper. He tied the knot. That will be $22, Henry said. His voice was completely flat. It gave nothing away. The man handed him a credit card. Henry looked at it. He didn't have a machine. He pointed to the sign on the wall that said cash only. "Oh, for heaven's sake," the man groaned. He dug into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled wad of bills. He peeled off 2 tens and a 5. He tossed them onto the wet counter, right next to the fish guts. He didn't hand them to Henry. He threw them. "Keep the change," the man said, even though the change was only $3, and the fish was 22. He hadn't even given the full amount. Henry looked at the money sitting in the mess. He looked at the man. "You are short $3, Henry said quietly. What? The man looked annoyed. "It's close enough. You should be grateful for the tip. Buy yourself a bar of soap." The women laughed again, louder this time. They turned and walked away, their fancy shoes clicking on the concrete floor. The man followed them, shaking his head as if he were the victim in this encounter. They didn't look back. They took the fish and left the money, and the insult, hanging in the air. Henry stood there for a long time. The market noise rushed back in the shouting, the chopping, the talking. But Henry felt very still. He looked at the crumpled bills on the counter. He reached out and slowly smoothed them out. He put them in the register. He didn't care about the money. He didn't care about the short change. It was the words. Weak mind. The phrase echoed in his head. It wasn't the first time he had heard something like that, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But today, for some reason, it stung more than usual. Maybe it was the arrogance. Maybe it was the assumption that because he handled fish, he was incapable of understanding anything else. Henry picked up his towel. He wiped the counter again, scrubbing hard at the spot where the money had been. He scrubbed until the metal was shining. He looked at his hands. They were red from the cold and the water. The knuckles were swollen. They were ugly hands to some people. But Henry knew what these hands could do. He knew that when he went home, these hands would touch something else. Something that required more than just strength. Something that required a soul. He looked up at the line of customers waiting. They were all looking at their phones or talking to each other. None of them knew what had just happened. To them, he was still just the fishmonger. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the salty, fishy air. He let it out slow. He squared his shoulders. Next, he said. The clock on the wall finally ticked past 4 o'clock. For Henry, this was the best time of the day. It was the time when the heavy metal shutters of the market stall came down with a loud crash, signaling that the work was done. The noise of the customers, the bargaining, and the constant movement faded away into a heavy silence. Henry moved slowly now. The rush was gone. He went through his closing routine, something he had done every day for decades. He scrubbed down the metal tables until they shone, removing every last scale and bit of slime. He hosed off the floor, pushing the dirty water into the drain. He counted the cash in the register, putting the bills in neat stacks, securing them in his pocket. When everything was clean and locked away, he reached up and unhooked his heavy rubber apron. He folded it carefully and placed it on a shelf. Then, he took off his boots. He stepped into a pair of old, clean sneakers. He put on a thick, gray wool coat that was starting to pill at the elbows. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and it was dry. He picked up his lunchbox, a battered metal thing that had seen better days, and walked out the back entrance. The air outside was crisp and cool. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the alleyway. Henry walked toward his pickup truck, an old rusted thing that rattled when he turned the key, but it always started. He didn't drive home. Instead, he drove across town, away from the rough part of the city where the market was, toward the nicer neighborhood near the city center. The truck's heater didn't work very well, so Henry drove with his coat buttoned all the way up to his chin. His hands gripped the steering wheel. The skin was still rough and red from the ice water, and even with the heater blowing lukewarm air, his knuckles felt stiff. He flexed his fingers a few times, trying to get the blood moving. His mind was still replaying the scene from the morning. The man in the gray coat. The insult. Weak mind. The words stuck in his head like a thorn that he couldn't pull out. It wasn't that he cared what that one man thought of him. He didn't care about being rich or wearing fancy clothes. He was proud of his work. Feeding people was honest work. But it was the assumption that bothered him. The assumption that just because he worked with his hands and smelled like fish, he had nothing going on inside. That he was empty. Henry pulled the truck into a parking spot behind a large brick building. It was the community center. A place where kids went to play basketball after school, and old people went to drink coffee and play cards. Henry had been coming here for years, 3 times a week, every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. He climbed out of the truck and walked around to the side entrance. He passed a group of teenagers laughing loudly as they left the gym. He nodded at them, but they didn't really notice him. He was just an old man in an old coat. He walked down a long hallway that smelled of floor wax and coffee. He stopped at a door near the end of the hall, next to the supply closet. It wasn't a fancy studio. It was just a large room used for meetings and small gatherings. In the corner of the room, sitting against the wall, was a piano. It wasn't a grand piano. It was an upright, covered in black varnish that was chipped in places. It had seen better days. Some of the keys were slightly yellowed with age. But to Henry, it was the most beautiful thing in the building. He walked in and closed the door behind him. The room was empty. The evening sun was filtering through the blinds, making stripes of light across the floor. Henry didn't turn on the overhead lights. He liked the dim, quiet feel of the room. It felt like a sanctuary. He walked over to the piano and set his lunchbox down on the floor beside the bench. He stood there for a moment, looking at the instrument. This was the moment of transition. This was the moment where he stopped being Henry the fishmonger. He sat down on the bench. It creaked under his weight. He pulled up his sleeves, exposing his forearms. Even in the dim light, you could see the scars, the small white lines from crab claws, the nicks from knives. His hands looked battered and worn. They looked like hands that could break things. But then, Henry reached out and placed those hands on the keys. He didn't play a note yet. He just rested them there. His left hand hovered over the low notes, his right hand over the high notes. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the quiet air. He closed his eyes. For a few seconds, he didn't move. He was listening. Not to the room, but to the music in his head. He was clearing away the smell of the fish. He was clearing away the sound of the man's voice. He was clearing away the cold and the fatigue. When he opened his eyes, they were different. They weren't hard and sharp like they were at the market. They were soft. They were focused. He pressed down a key. A low, deep A note resonated through the room. It vibrated through the floorboards. Then, he played a chord. It was a simple chord, but he held it, letting the sound swell and fade into the silence. Then, he began to play in earnest. It wasn't a nursery rhyme. It wasn't a simple folk song. It was a piece by a composer named Chopin. It was complex and difficult. His fingers, which were stiff and claw-like only minutes ago, suddenly became fluid. They moved with a grace that seemed impossible. If someone had looked through the small window in the door, they wouldn't have believed what they were seeing. The hands that were so rough, so stained, so scarred, were dancing over the ivory keys. They were delicate. He caressed the keys, pressing them softly to draw out a whisper of sound, then striking them firmly to make the piano sing. The music filled the empty room. It wasn't just sound, it was emotion. It was sad and beautiful at the same time. It sounded like rain on a roof, like a distant memory, like a dream you can't quite remember. Henry didn't read music. He never learned how to read the notes on a page. He had learned to play by ear when he was just a boy, long before he ever touched a fish. He had an old radio that he would listen to late at night, and he would mimic the sounds he heard on the family piano. Over the years, he had memorized hundreds of pieces. He played them from memory, feeling the music flow from his mind, down his arms, and out of his fingertips. As he played, his shoulders relaxed. The tension in his back, the result of standing on concrete for 8 hours, began to melt away. The frown lines on his forehead smoothed out. The image of the arrogant man in the coat began to blur and fade. Here, in this room, with these hands, Henry wasn't simple. He wasn't just a fishmonger. He was an artist. He was a creator. The piano responded to him. The worn hammers struck the strings, creating a tone that was warm and rich. Henry lost track of time. He forgot about the dirty market. He forgot about the early morning start. He just played. The notes climbed higher and higher, trilling and cascading down like water over rocks. It was a sound so pure it felt like a secret. He was playing for himself, but he was also playing for everyone who had ever looked at him and seen nothing. He was putting all his intelligence, all his feeling, all his soul into the keys. Every note was a word he wanted to say but couldn't. Every phrase was a piece of his heart that he usually kept hidden behind a wall of silence. In the quiet community center, surrounded by empty chairs and dust motes dancing in the light, Henry was finally free. And his rough, tired hands were creating something beautiful. The music was filling the room, swirling around the ceiling fans and settling into the corners. Henry was lost in it. His eyes were half closed, his head tilted slightly to the side. He wasn't thinking about his hands anymore. He wasn't thinking about the stiffness in his knuckles or the scars on his skin. The music had taken over. It was like a river flowing through him, and his hands were just the banks that guided it. He was playing a piece that started soft and slow, a deep, melancholy melody that seemed to cry out. But then, the pace changed. The music grew faster, more intense. Henry's fingers moved across the keys with a blur of motion. They were heavy, thick fingers, but they were incredibly precise. They didn't just hit the notes, they shaped them. He pressed down hard on the keys to make the sound roar, and then he lifted his hands at the last second to let the sound fade into a whisper. Outside in the hallway, the noise of the community center was going on as usual. There was the thud of a basketball in the gym down the hall. There was the sound of a vacuum cleaner running in another room. People were walking by, talking on their phones or chatting with friends. A young woman named Lisa, who worked at the front desk, was walking down the hall carrying a stack of flyers. She was tired. It had been a long day of answering phones and dealing with complaints. She wasn't paying much attention to the doors she passed until she walked past the room where Henry was playing. She stopped. She turned her head. The door wasn't fully closed. There was a gap of about 2 inches. Through that gap, the sound was spilling out into the hallway. It wasn't just noise. It was captivating. Lisa frowned. She knew the schedule. There were no piano lessons booked for this hour. The Tuesday night jazz band usually didn't start until 7. She stepped closer to the door, being careful not to make a sound with her shoes. She peeked through the crack in the door. What she saw made her blink. She saw the back of a large man in a gray wool coat sitting at the piano. He looked huge, hunched over the keyboard, but the sound coming from the instrument was delicate and intricate. It sounded professional. It sounded like something you would hear in a concert hall, not in a dusty community room. Lisa watched Henry's hands. She saw the rough skin, the swollen knuckles. She noticed the way his right hand seemed to jump effortlessly over the difficult sections of the music, while his left hand kept a steady, deep rhythm. She couldn't see his face, but she could see his posture. He was vibrating with the music. He was swaying slightly back and forth. She didn't recognize him. She didn't know that he was the quiet man from the market. To her, he was a mystery. A man with the hands of a laborer and the soul of a poet. She stood there for a long time, forgetting about the flyers in her arms. The music seemed to wash away her tiredness. It was sad, but it was also hopeful. It sounded like a story about a hard life, but a life that was worth living. Down the hall, a door opened. A teenager named Toby came out of the game room. He was holding a soda can, looking bored. He saw Lisa standing by the door, staring into the room. "What are you looking at?" Toby asked, his voice loud in the hallway. Lisa put her finger to her lips, signaling him to be quiet. "Shh," she whispered. "Listen." Toby rolled his eyes. He walked over, his sneakers squeaking on the floor. "Is that a CD or something?" "No, it's live," Lisa whispered back. "Just listen." Toby stopped. He leaned his head toward the door. At first, he didn't care much. He liked hip-hop and rock. But as he stood there, the piano music caught his attention. It was fast and complicated. It sounded like a movie soundtrack, like the part where the hero is running or fighting. "Whoa," Toby said quietly. He moved to stand next to Lisa and looked through the crack. "Who is that guy?" "I don't know," Lisa said. More people began to gather. It started slowly. A woman who was there for a yoga class walked by and stopped, curious. Then the janitor, who was pushing his mop bucket, paused to rest and listen. Even the director of the center, a busy man named Mr. Henderson, walked by. He was checking his watch, annoyed about something, but the music made him stop. He took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes, just listening. There were now about 6 people standing in the hallway. They were all silent. They were all looking through the gap in the door, watching this large, rough-looking man pour his heart out into the old piano. Inside the room, Henry had no idea he had an audience. He was in a different world. He was remembering things. He was remembering his mother, who used to sing to him when he was little. He was remembering the smell of the sea on a good day, when the sky was blue and the water was calm. He was taking the insult from the morning the weak mind comment and he was answering it. He answered it with a flurry of notes that were so complex and so fast that they would have been impossible for a simple man to play. His fingers were like 10 independent workers, each knowing exactly what to do. He hit a wrong note once, a sharp clink that didn't belong, but he didn't stop. He didn't flinch. He just kept playing, weaving the mistake into the music, making it part of the story. That was the mark of a true master. Someone who didn't fear imperfection. The music swelled to a crescendo. It was loud, filling the room and vibrating the floor. The sound was so powerful that the people in the hallway could feel it in their chests. It was a sound of defiance. It was a sound that said, "I am here. I am more than you see." Then, just as suddenly as it had gotten loud, the music softened. Henry transitioned into a gentle, flowing section. The notes were like raindrops falling on a tin roof. The mood shifted from anger to peace. It was as if Henry was forgiving the world for not understanding him. He was forgiving the man in the gray coat, not for the man's sake, but for his own. The people in the hallway were mesmerized. Toby, the teenager, had stopped drinking his soda. He was just staring. He had never seen anyone play with that kind of intensity. He looked at the janitor, and the janitor looked at him. They shared a moment of connection. They were witnessing something special. Something that didn't happen every day. Lisa felt a chill run down her arms. She realized that this wasn't just a hobbyist. This was a man who had a gift that he probably didn't get to share very often. She wondered where he came from. She wondered what his life was like. She looked at his rough clothes and his worn-out sneakers, and she felt a pang of guilt for judging people by their appearance. She had assumed that everyone who came to the center for the cheap rooms was just looking for a place to kill time. She was wrong. The piece was coming to an end. Henry slowed the pace down. The melody became simple again, echoing the notes he had started with. He played a final chord, a deep, rich sound that seemed to hang in the air forever. He held his hands on the keys, letting the vibration die away naturally. He didn't lift them immediately. He sat there, breathing hard, his shoulders rising and falling with the effort. The room was completely silent. The silence was heavy, but it was a good kind of heavy. It was a respectful silence. In the hallway, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They didn't want to break the spell. They didn't want the moment to end. They just stood there, holding their breath, looking at the back of the man who had shown them something beautiful without even knowing they were there. The fishmonger had played, and for a few minutes, he had turned the dusty, ordinary world into something magical. The silence stretched out, long and heavy, filling the room like a physical presence. Inside, Henry sat with his hands resting on the keys, his head bowed. He was breathing deeply, his chest rising and falling under his gray wool coat. The last vibration of the piano strings had faded into nothingness, leaving only the quiet hum of the building. Out in the hallway, the small crowd of listeners stood frozen. They were afraid that if they moved, if they made a single sound, the magic of the moment would break. The teenager, Toby, realized his mouth was slightly open and closed it. The janitor stopped leaning on his mop handle and stood up straight, his face serious. Lisa, the receptionist, felt a strange tightness in her throat, a feeling that often comes right before tears, though she wasn't sad. She was moved. Nobody knew what to do. Should they clap? Should they knock? Should they walk away? It felt like intruding to enter, but it felt wrong to leave without acknowledging what they had heard. Henry didn't know they were there. He slowly lifted his hands from the keys. The movement seemed to take a lot of effort. He looked down at his fingers. They were trembling slightly, just a little shake from the adrenaline and the force of the playing. To him, they just looked like the same old hands, rough, scarred, and marked by his work. But for a few minutes, they had been something else. He sighed, a long, weary sound that escaped his lips before he could stop it. He felt lighter, though. The anger that had been sitting in his stomach like a stone all day was gone. The man in the gray coat didn't matter anymore. The insult had been washed away by the music. Henry had proved to himself, once again, who he really was. He didn't need the man's approval, and he didn't need his respect. He reached down to the floor and picked up his battered lunchbox. He slid it into his coat pocket. Then, he stood up. The bench creaked again as his weight left it. The sound of the bench was like a signal in the quiet hallway. It broke the spell. Lisa instinctively took a step back, bumping into Toby. "Oops," Toby whispered, but it was loud in the quiet. Inside the room, Henry froze. He turned his head sharply toward the door. His eyes, which had been soft and misty a moment ago, suddenly widened. He looked like a caught animal. His guard went up instantly. His shoulders hunched, and his jaw tightened. Who was there? Had the manager come to tell him he was making too much noise? Had someone complained? He felt a flush of embarrassment climb up his neck. He wasn't performing, he was just a worker playing in a break room. He felt exposed. He walked quickly toward the door, intending to just grab the handle and leave, maybe say a quick sorry if he had to. He pulled the door open. He stopped short. There, standing in the dimly lit hallway, was a group of people. Henry looked at them. He saw the teenager with the soda. He saw the janitor with the mop. He saw the woman in the yoga clothes. He saw the front desk girl. They were all looking at him. Their faces weren't annoyed. They weren't telling him to be quiet. They were just looking. And the looks on their faces were something Henry had never seen directed at him before. It was a look of wonder. It was a look of respect. For a second, nobody spoke. The air was thick with unspoken words. Henry gripped the strap of his lunchbox tight. He felt a sudden urge to run. He felt like he had been caught doing something he shouldn't, even though he knew he was allowed to be there. I didn't mean to disturb anyone, Henry mumbled. His voice was raspy, quieter than usual. He looked down at his boots. I was just finishing up. He moved to step past them, to escape down the hall toward the exit. Wait, Lisa said. It wasn't a command. It was soft, almost a plea. Henry stopped, but he didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the floor. That was beautiful, Lisa said. She took a small step forward. I didn't know you could play like that. I've worked here for 5 years, and I've never heard anything like that. Henry shrugged, trying to act like it was no big deal. He didn't want to make a scene. Just something to pass the time, he muttered. Good for the fingers. Pass the time, Toby, the teenager, blurted out. He couldn't help himself. Dude, that was insane. My sister plays piano, and she takes lessons, but she doesn't sound like that. How do you do that with? He stopped himself, realizing he was about to mention Henry's hands. Henry looked at the boy. He saw the genuine curiosity in his eyes. Henry looked down at his own hands, hanging by his sides. They looked rough and ugly in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. Practice, Henry said simply. Lots of practice. And I don't know. It's just in here. He tapped the side of his head, then his chest, right over his heart. The janitor, an older man who didn't talk much, nodded his head slowly. Music is good for the soul, the janitor said gruffly. Keeps the cold out. He looked at Henry with a nod of solidarity. They were both working men. They understood the value of finding something warm in a cold life. Henry felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't used to kindness. He wasn't used to being seen. At the market, he was a ghost. Here, in this hallway, he was being recognized. It felt overwhelming. Thank you, Henry whispered. He actually looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time. He saw that they weren't mocking him. They were just people who had been touched by the music. I have to go now. Work early tomorrow. Will you be back next week? Lisa asked quickly. Henry paused. He thought about the market. He thought about the heavy lifting and the cold water. He thought about the silence of his apartment. Then he thought about the piano. Yeah, Henry said. Thursday. I'll be here Thursday. Good, Lisa said. She smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached her eyes. We'll listen quietly next time. I promise. Henry gave a small, awkward nod. He tightened his grip on his lunchbox and walked past them. He walked down the hallway, his rubber boots squeaking on the floor. The group watched him go. They didn't say anything until the heavy side door opened and closed behind him with a thud. "He's the fish guy from the downtown market," Toby said suddenly, remembering where he had seen the face before. "I go there with my mom sometimes." "He sells the crabs." "Really?" Lisa asked, looking down the hall toward the door. "The fishmonger?" "Yeah. He never talks," Toby said. "Just chops fish." Lisa shook her head slowly. "Well," she said softly, "I guess you can't judge a book by its cover." Outside, the evening air was cool. Henry walked to his truck. The street lights were flickering on. The world felt different to him now. It wasn't that the streets had changed, or that his truck was suddenly new. But he felt lighter. The weight of the morning was gone. He climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment. He looked at his hands resting on the steering wheel. In the market, these hands were judged. People saw the scars and the dirt and they made assumptions. They thought he was slow. They thought he was simple. But they didn't know. They didn't know that inside those rough, weathered hands was a symphony. Henry started the engine. It roared to life, noisy and rough. He smiled a little to himself. He didn't need the man in the gray coat to respect him. He had the music. And tonight, for a few minutes, he had let a room full of strangers hear it too. That was enough. He put the truck in gear and drove away, heading home to get some rest, ready to do it all again tomorrow. But this time, as he drove, he hummed a melody. It was a quiet tune, floating in the air of the cab, a song that only he knew, played by hands that told the truth.